Testing arrangements for people entering the city will be fine-tuned. A new COVID infection cluster at another bar in Central. Hello and welcome to TVB News. The government says it will fine-tune the testing arrangements for people entering Hong Kong starting on Wednesday. There will also be changes to the flight suspension mechanism for airlines. Caleb Leung has more details.
Currently, an airline company will be punished if any of its aircraft arrives in Hong Kong with 3 passengers testing positive for COVID, and if 1 or more non-compliant cases are allowed to board the plane. The penalty is all planes of the same airline originating from the same city will be banned from landing in the city for 5 days. But starting June 1st, if it is the first violation within a 10-day period for a certain flight to trigger the flight suspension mechanism, the airline will be issued a warning and slapped with a penalty of $20,000. If another flight of the relevant route and airline triggers the mechanism again within 10 days, the passenger flights of that service route will be prohibited from landing in Hong Kong for 5 days. But as before, an airline will still be given a 5-day suspension on the first instance if 5 or more passengers, or 5% or more of the total number of passengers on the same flight, test positive for COVID after arriving in the city. Also starting June 1st, passengers transferring or transiting in the city no longer have to present proof of a 48-hour pre-departure nucleic acid test. Inbound travelers under 3 years old will no longer be required to take a nucleic acid test before boarding the flight. For other passengers, the documentary proof of negative results of pre-departure nucleic acid tests will not necessarily be issued by accredited laboratories or healthcare institutions. But aside from getting tested on the 5th and 12th day of their arrival, inbound travelers are also required to get tested on the 9th day. Government Health Advisor David Hui said the changes will bring little risk to Hong Kong as the city has a high vaccination rate and those who are transferring or transiting at the airport have to wait in designated areas. Cathay Pacific welcomed the adjustments, adding that it has resumed more flights in response to recent measures. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
The city reported 237 new COVID-19 infections, including 37 imported cases. The infection cluster linked to a bar in Lang Kwai Fong continues to grow. And today, authorities flagged 1 more bar in Central, where 11 patrons have contracted the virus so far. Jackie Lin with details.
This is the latest virus hit bar in Central, Iron Fairies and Jay Borowski. 1 man and 10 women who visited the establishment on May 21st have come down with COVID-19. They had stayed there between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. the next morning.
They have mask-off activities inside the bar. Some of them, they have dancing activity, and also they drink alcohol. So we suspected that there may be a super spreader or an infectious person who had entered this bar on that night.
As for the outbreak at Central, a bar in Lang Kwai Fong, 4 new cases have been uncovered. They brought the total number of infections there to 15, with the patients aged between 17 and 29. One of them was said to have stayed in the queue outside the bar without entering it. Altogether, around 1,400 customers visited the 2 virus hit bars in Central at the same time as these patients. At Po Kwai Hospital Tam Pui K Memorial College in Yuen Long, 1 more student of an infected part-time basketball coach who visited the Central Bar tested positive for COVID. So far, 7 of the 30 students who attended his class have been infected. At Tuen Mun Hospital, authorities are rushing to screen 21 patients in the Department of Orthopedics and Traumatology for COVID. That's after 2 infected nurses were found to be carrying high viral loads of the coronavirus. Today, no new COVID-related deaths have been reported. Meanwhile, Secretary for the Civil Service Patrick Nip, who is in charge of the city's COVID vaccination program, says 600,000 residents still haven't taken their 3rd jab. Those who are not triple jabbed won't be able to enter multiple public venues and restaurants starting Tuesday. That's the day the 3rd phase of the vaccine pass takes effect. Jackie Lin, TVB News.
The mainland logged 215 new domestic COVID infections. More than half of the cases were reported in Shanghai. With the pandemic situation continuing to improve, Shanghai looks set to end a 2-month lockdown. To encourage people to return to work starting Wednesday, testing requirements in the city will be relaxed. From then on, people entering public venues or taking public transport will need to show a negative PCR test taken within 72 hours. That's eased from the previous 48 hours. Measures are also being rolled out to support Shanghai's economy, which has been hammered by anti-epidemic curbs. They include reducing some taxes on car purchases, accelerating issuance of local government bonds, and speeding up approval of real estate projects. The capital city, Beijing, meanwhile, added 21 infections. Libraries, museums, and gyms there have been allowed to reopen today with caps on visitor numbers. The Russian Defense Ministry said it had successfully conducted another test of a hypersonic Zircon cruise missile. The missile fired from a frigate in the Barents Sea flew a distance of around 1,000 kilometers before landing in the White Sea. The launch was the latest in a series of tests of Zircon, which is set to enter service later this year. Hypersonic weapons can travel at 9 times the speed of sound. Russian President Vladimir Putin has described the weapons as part of an unrivaled arms system. Zircon is intended to be deployed on cruisers, frigates, and submarines. Putin has warned Western nations that Zircon could strike decision-making centers within minutes if deployed in neutral waters. Still ahead after the break. The UN Human Rights Chief comments on her trip to China. And a small plane with 22 people on board goes missing in Nepal. Welcome back to TVB News. UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has urged China to review its counterterrorism policies to ensure they comply with international human rights standards. This came after her 6-day visit to the country concluded on Saturday. Still, Bachelet says her trip was an opportunity to engage with Beijing rather than an investigation into China's human rights record. Daniel Rao reports.
UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet's 6-day visit to China drew to an end on Saturday. Her trip was the first by a UN Commissioner for Human Rights to the country in 17 years. Bachelet toured China under a closed-loop arrangement to prevent the spread of COVID-19. She began her stay in Guangzhou before eventually heading to Xinjiang. Last year, her office had raised concerns that Uyghurs in the region may have been unlawfully detained and subject to forced labor. Bachelet discussed the allegations in an online press briefing on Saturday. Beijing denies all accusations of abuse in Xinjiang, but said it had set up vocational training centers to combat what it calls separatism and religious radicalism there.
In the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regions, I have raised questions and concerns about the application of counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures under broad application, particularly the impact on the right of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities.
During the media briefing, Bachelet also described the detention of activists, lawyers and journalists in Hong Kong as deeply worrying. Still, she said her visit to China was not an investigation into the country's human rights policies, but rather an opportunity to engage with the government. Bachelet also praised Beijing's tremendous progress in alleviating poverty and introducing universal health care.
Poverty alleviation and the eradication of extreme poverty, 10 years ahead of its target date, are tremendous achievements of China. The introduction of universal health care and almost universal unemployment insurance scheme go a long way in ensuring protection of the rights to health and broader social and economic rights.
Vice Foreign Minister Ma Jiaoshu said Bachelet's visit achieved positive and concrete results with the efforts of both sides. Ma added that the trip helped enhance the understanding of China's path on human rights development and strengthened Beijing's cooperation with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. On Xinjiang, Ma said certain countries have fabricated sensational lies for their own political motives under the guise of human rights concerns. Daniel Rao, TVB News.
In Nepal, a small airplane with 22 people on board flying on a popular tourist route went missing today. The Terra Airlines plane was on a 15-minute scheduled flight to a mountain town. It took off from the resort town of Pokhara, 200 kilometers east of Kathmandu. It lost contact with the airport tower shortly after takeoff. Reports say there were 6 foreigners on board the plane, including 4 Indians and 2 Germans. It has been raining in the area for the past few days, but flights have been operating normally. In 2016, a Terra Airlines Twin Otter flying the same route crashed after takeoff, killing all 23 people on board. Back here at home, a recent pay trend survey endorsed pay raises for civil servants ranging from between 2% to 7%. The announcement was criticized by business groups and lawmakers alike. However, the Secretary for the Civil Service believes demands for a salary increase are reasonable, citing that civil servants' pay has been frozen for the last 2 years. Timothy Lee has the story.
In the recent pay trend survey, recommendations were made to increase the salaries of junior civil servants by 2.04%, middle-ranking workers by 4.55%, and senior staff by 7.26%. Speaking with TVB News, Secretary for the Civil Service, Patrick Nip, said the survey result is only one of the 6 factors that the government and executive council will consider before any implementation takes place.
These 6 factors include the result of the pay trend survey, the pay claim of the staff side, civil service morale, and also the economic situation of Hong Kong, the government's fiscal position, and also the changes in the cost of living.
Nip also said it is understandable that civil servants are expecting a pay raise, but the decision must be made through a comparison with the private sector.
I think as regards the civil service is concerned, in the past 2 years, they already been given a pay freeze. So at least the legitimate expectation would be there would be some degree of pay rise. It would take into account the situation in the private sector, so as to maintain the attractions in terms of recruitment and retention of staff in the civil service.
KPIs, or Key Performance Indicators, is a system suggested by Chief Executive Designate John Lee for civil servants to achieve immediate results for the public. When asked how the KPI system will be factored into the pay raise, Nip said he is uncertain about the threshold for civil servants among the public.
Whether it is desirable to introduce some sort of a performance pay mechanism in the civil service so that to better manage the performance of the civil service, that would be an issue. Of course, we could look into it, whether it is desirable.
On the Hong Kong General Chamber of Commerce's criticism about the unrealistic pay trend survey results, Nip believes the GCC is merely expressing their concern as Hong Kong's economy shrunk by 4% in the first quarter of the year. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
The public consultation to review the statutory minimum wage level is set to end on Tuesday. The Labour chief today dismissed the public appeal for yearly reviews of the minimum wage as impractical. In his blog, Secretary of the Labour and Welfare Department Lau Chi Kwong says reviewing the minimum wage on a yearly basis would require a big overhaul and streamlining of the current framework. He says while an annual review is possible at the legislative level, the research, analysis, and consultation work involved will take 2 years to complete. Law added he hopes the Minimum Wage Commission could submit the latest recommendation report to the Executive Council by the end of October. Hong Kong introduced the statutory minimum wage in 2011. The rate was raised to $37.50 in 2019. That's the news. Have a great rest of the evening.